for London.
As you know, the government published consultation a revised version of the NPPF on 5th of March. I'll be sending a full response to the government by the deadline of the 10th of May. It looks like the officials have read part of my draft on the plan, as some of the policies in the NPPF look very similar, which is good news. I set out new policies in my draft plan to increase development around stations and town centres, and to increase the contribution of housing supply from small sites. I introduced the Agent for Change policy and strengthen protection of Greenbelt. All of these are in the draft NPPF, which we welcome. It's not all good news for London. I'm worried about their approach to viability in the NPPF. It does introduce greater transparency for assessments, which I welcome, but I'm concerned about their approach to enable developers to reduce affordable housing commitments after they've secured it. They've been secured through the planning process, and I'm worried we could have the reintroduction of a downward viability review, despite a similar measure being revoked only 2 years ago. We saw with Battersea Power Station what that can often lead to. I'm also unhappy about them taking the unprecedented step of specifying a 20% profit for developers, removing important flexibility from viability negotiations.
Thank you. Thank you for that answer. I too was very struck on reading it on how many of your London plan policies anticipate, really, the NPPF proposals. But there's one massive problem, in my view, which is that Mrs May she's taking personal responsibility for this, and she's shifting the blame onto councils for not increasing housing supply. And it's an irony almost. I mean, we all know that she's not going to reach that 300,000 target for homes being built per year across the country unless she provides the finance and the mechanisms for councils. And perversely, she's almost shackling local authorities by not allowing them to lift the HRA borrowing cap at a time when interest rates continue to be so low. So my question to you would be, do you agree that she should be doing more to set councils free, to invest in the homes that Londoners need?
Well, look, we engage, contrary to the views, what some people may believe, we engage constructively with government, with officials and with ministers. And one of the things we shared with them, which they know, is if you look at the house building since the 1920s, the amount of homes that the private sector builds is, roughly speaking, on average about 30,000, take or leave. The only times where there's been a big increase in homes built is where the state, national, local, regional governments play a role in supplementing homes built by the private sector. So if we're going to meet the needs of London, the government says, roughly speaking, 72,000. We say, roughly speaking, 66,000. But let's say, for argument's sake, it's about 70,000. If we're going to go from 30,000 to 70,000, and we know history tells us the private sector can't fill that void, the only alternative is councils, regional government, and the government, which is why it doesn't make sense, the government's reluctance to allow councils to build more homes, to remove the HRA limits, to give them powers in relation to allocation, compiling, bringing together land, changing the rules around CPOs, giving bigger grants to London and other parts of the country who could do a lot more with sufficient grants. It doesn't make sense at all. And so it's as if the left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing. And my point to the government when I meet with them, I make this point publicly as well as privately, is we want to help you meet the promises you've made. We want to help you actually keep this promise. It's in our interest to do so because Londoners need these homes. Councils are queuing up. They want to build homes. With sufficient resources, sufficient planning powers, they could do a huge amount. But they've got not one, they've got 1.5 hands tied behind their backs, and it's incredibly frustrating for them as well.
I agree with that. And in fact, what we know is that councils are actually giving planning permission for 9 out of 10 of the applications that come before them.
Well, can I say on that point, it's a really important point. You see, there was this myth that I think we've bust now, which is that the problem is the lack of permissions being granted. And to give the Chancellor credit, I made this point to him when I met with him before his last budget. And I said, hold on a sec, in London alone, there were roughly speaking 200,000 permissions granted, they're a bit more than that, granted where homes haven't been built. Some haven't even been started. And so it's not the council's fault. And to give the Chancellor credit, he's asked Oliver Letwin to do a piece of work to find out why all these permissions have been granted by councils, yet homes aren't being built. And so action's got to be taken there as well.
Are you optimistic about Letwin's review? He's just issued his interim letter, and I just wondered whether you clearly are lobbying him. Are you optimistic we're going to get what we want?
I was very impressed by his knowledge when we met on this subject recently. He was clearly on top of the facts. He's done his homework. Many of the points that I was going to make to him, he said to me in the opening. The first part of his review is what is a problem. The second part, which reports back in time for the Chancellor's autumn budget, is what we can do about it. So far, positive report from me as far as Oliver Letwin's concerned, but clearly we'll have to wait and see what the recommendations are to address the issue of the numbers of homes given permission, but no action being taken. Unless in his recommendations he actually talks about resources being given, support being given to regional government and local government, I'm not really sure how else you can address the issue of the housing crisis in London and across the country.